Hello, friends, and welcome to the program. You know, in 1988, I remember watching the PBS documentary, Joseph Campbell and the Power of Myth. The documentary was originally broadcast as 6 one-hour conversations between mythologist Joseph Campbell and journalist Bill Moyers during the final 2 summers of Campbell's life. In these discussions, Campbell presents his ideas about comparative mythology and the ongoing role of myth in human society. These talks included excerpts from Campbell's seminal work, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. Now, that documentary certainly changed my life, and I think the lives of thousands of people who were searching for a new way of being religious, a more contemporary and multicultural understanding of God. Metaphors of the divine life which would not only preserve the beauty and the wisdom of their mythic origins, but could also be held in harmony with the notions and the metaphors coming out of contemporary cosmology. You know, Joseph Campbell was fond of saying that if you want to change the world, you have to change the metaphor. And that's precisely what he helped so many of us achieve. He gave us new insights into the nature of religious consciousness, and he helped us to understand the poetic and the metaphoric nature of religious myths and symbols. On the 25th anniversary of the documentary, Bill Moyers shared these reflections on his friend Joseph Campbell. Moyers said, "At a time when millions of people were yearning for a way of talking about religious experience without regard to a rigid belief system, Campbell gave them a language for it. He said that myths were clues to our spiritual nature and that they could help us be guides to find a sacred space within us where we might unlock the creative powers of our deeper self." I find the same creative spirituality alive and well in the works of John Knight Lundwall. I first discovered John's novel interpretation of mythology by watching his many riveting videos on YouTube, and not long ago discovered that he had written an absorbing and engaging new book on the nature of mythic consciousness called Mythos and Cosmos, Mind and Meaning in the Oral Age. Recently, he was kind enough to join us in our studios here on the coast of Northern California, where we had the following conversation. Good day, friends, and welcome to the studio. Today we're going to be joined by my friend John Lundwall, Dr. John Lundwall, who just wrote a brand new 350-page book called Mythos and Cosmos, Mind and Meaning in the Oral Age. John holds a doctorate degree in comparative myth and religious studies, and he's the chief editor of Cosmos and Logos, a journal of myth, religion, and folklore. Welcome, John. Thank you so much for coming to our studios. I've always been interested in mythology, and so I've read many, many books over the years in mythology. And I was very, very struck by your new book because you seem to be offering a really creative and very new understanding of myth. What was it exactly that was your intention? What did you want to accomplish by writing this work?
Well, look, this work is a result of several years of asking questions that interested me. When I was a teenager, I gave myself the challenge of reading all the religious texts of all the world's religions. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. I was too naive. You can only be naive to give yourself that challenge. But over the next 20, 30 years, I did that. And you don't have to read long before you encounter some very basic questions like, what am I reading? How does this doesn't even make sense. What is this? You read the Mahabharata, India's national epic, and it's full of strange characters, costumes, very mythic. And so as you start reading these religious texts, you get into reading myths. And I had several questions that I wanted to answer, and so you read theories of myths, theories of religion, and many of these theories were not answering my questions. And I wasn't agreeing with them anyway. So I decided to make my lifelong study official. I got a graduate degree in myth studies, comparative myth and religious traditions. And while searching for some very basic answers, I decided, well, there's not really a book that really answers what I'm looking for, so I'm going to have to write it. So that's what I did.
So there were many different theories of a myth that you read about, but there wasn't a particular theory of myth that captured your imagination.
Well, they all captured my imagination to a degree. You know, when you study ancient myths, I mean, to be honest, when you read anthologies of myths, most of them come across to the Western literate mind as a bunch of gibberish, and many people treat them that way. And so when you study myth, you eventually have to do the only thing in order to decipher them, you have to study the theory of myth. Comparative myth studies is really studying theories of myth. And over the past 100 years, there's been very smart people, far smarter than I, spending their entire lives trying to tackle what do ancient mythologies mean, why were they created, where do they come from? And really, as I was reading through all these theories, I began realizing that these theories all had a priori assumptions. And I began kind of articulating, well, how did they form this theory and why did they form it? And after a while you realize, well, all these theories are products of present thinking, present theory, present ideology projected onto the past. Now, in many regards, that's unavoidable, right? The ancient oral world is gone, the ancient myth makers are gone, and the truth of the matter is ancient myth was not a text. So all we have are anthologies of myths written down. So already there's a problem because they were never text. They were sung, they were danced, they were ritualized, they were chanted, they involved cloth and mass and tattoos and festivals. All that's gone. And so really we just have to theorize how this comes to us. And so my particular approach is to put a new tweak, create a slightly different look, a new theory of ancient myth by looking at ancient cultures and ancient myths through the lens of oral thinking and its consequences, and especially oral cosmology and how that frames people's worldviews and how myths come out of that cosmology.
So in your opinion, perhaps not all ancient mythologies coming out of the oral tradition are cosmological, but most of them are cosmological. They're about the nature of the universe and understanding the human being's place in it then.
Well, yes. Look, ancient religion and ancient cosmology are synonymous. Mm-hmm. So we'll have to get into just exactly what cosmology is and how that relates. But all the gods and characters and heroes of ancient myths descend from metaphors. And Campbell calls them psychological metaphors. And there's a lot of truth to that. But they're rooted in cosmological, celestial ideas, celestial metaphors. So while a myth may actually be describing something very earthy and very terrestrial, many of the motifs descend from oral cosmology, their view of heaven and earth and how they relate. And so in that sense, there is a strong myth is saturated with cosmic themes, so much so that the stratas of myth descend from a particular way of looking at the universe, a way that we have forgotten, a way that we have overwritten and called primitive oftentimes or silly, but it's actually a sophisticated metaphysics grown out of an oral world?
Well, that's very interesting. I found also in your introduction, you have this fascinating typology that you use about 3 underlying assumptions, you call it, that people have about the ancient past. You call them the howlers, the romantics, and the conspirators. Yeah.
Yes. Well, when you read books, both popular and academic, you come across 3 overarching historical views of history. And I did name them. The first is, I call them the howlers. It sounds maybe like a pejorative term, but I get the term. In 1965, an astronomy professor named Gerald Hawkins wrote a book called Stonehenge Decoded. He was from Boston University, and he was the first person to popularize the idea that the standing stones at Stonehenge were aligned to the rising and setting sun on solstice and equinox days. So he had a radical theory. These stones weren't just some lumps of rock. They were a sort of ancient computer that calculated celestial cycles. Well, he wasn't an archaeologist. He wasn't an anthropologist. He wasn't a historian. And mainstream academia destroyed this guy's theory. And the leading archaeologist in Britain, a man named Richard Atkins, wrote an article called Moonshine on Stonehenge, where he criticized Hawkins' work, and he said, look, we all know that Stonehenge was built by a bunch of howling barbarians, end quote. Well, it turns out Hawkins was right, and the mainstream academic community was wrong, simply because it did not enter into their paradigm that ancient peoples could build structures aligned to the rising and setting sun. Well, as it turns out, now that people are looking for these things, this whole new field of archaeoastronomy has been created. We find that the ancient megalithic world is full of these astral alignments, and structures and standing stones are not only aligned to the rising and setting sun, but they're aligned to the rising cycles of the moon, as well as specific stars in the sky. So this means that there is a detailed cosmology that underwrites the construction of these sites. And if it underwrites the construction of these sites, it's going to underwrite their religious constructs. And in an oral age, it's going to underwrite their myths.
So you would want to make the argument that part of the problem in the past with understanding of myth, how it functions, and its original intention coming out of oral culture was because of our own prejudice, that we just automatically assume that people who lived 1,000 years ago or 2,000 to 3,000 years ago were basically barbarians and idiots, and we're just so much more smarter than those people.
Well, you know, actually, that is a truth that probably goes back centuries. The present generation may always, well, actually in the mythic world, they were always looking back to the golden age. They thought the people in the past were much brighter than they were, and that they had lost something essential. But the howling point of view is very popular, and it is exactly what you just said. Everyone believes, everyone in the ancient past, or the people who ascribe to this, were primitive, less intelligent, less evolved, right? That the mind, the human mind, hadn't evolved to the sophistication of the modern mind. And it's easy to think this. You know, you go out on an archaeological dig and you dig up a bone and a piece of pottery, and you take out your iPhone and you take a picture of it and you say, these guys were idiots. Because you have an iPhone that's GPS to a satellite that was shot up there by a rocket, and you got a piece of pottery, right? So it's easy to assume this, but this is an illusion. What we're comparing is technologies. And as it turns out, it takes thousands of years to build up a knowledge base vertically in order to create a technology like an iPhone. But most importantly, it takes writing and literacy to build an iPhone. 99% of human history exists in orality, people who did not read or write. They were not illiterate, they were pre-literate. And there's some things you can't do without writing. You can't make an iPhone. But because you can't make an iPhone, we assume they just never had sophisticated thoughts enough to make an iPhone. And so when we find Stonehenge aligned to celestial movements or the pyramids or the temples, this doesn't quite fit in our howling primitive conception. Let me just speak real quick on these other two historical points of view. I think, by the way, that the howling point of view is in the words of a mathematician, Giulio Magli, a silly and sloppy hypothesis of history. People 10,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago, were just as intelligent as people today, as you and I. They had the same hardware. They were operating off of different software, right? Orality has consequences, and literacy has consequences. So when you start detailing these, much of the ancient world, in my opinion, starts to make sense, and I write a lot about this in my book. The other historical point of view is what I call the Romantics. Mm-hmm. So the howlers are people who believe that people in the ancient past are howling barbarians. They're primitive. They could only make pottery. And the Romantics are people who romanticize history by saying that everyone in the ancient past was spiritual, was connected with the landscape, was deeply in tune with the psyche and with the rhythms of the universe. Well, actually, there's some truth to that. However, when you look in the ancient past, you see human sacrifice, ritualized prostitution, deforestation of entire landscapes. Myths tend to be extremely violent. This is not a world where everyone's holding hands and singing Kumbaya. It is a gritty, hard world, like the world is today. So there's this romantic view that I think also misses the mark. And the romantic view is very popular. The howling view was popular all the way up until a few decades ago. Scholars have really started to make inroads on that. But now the romantic view has kind of replaced it. And the third, oh yes.
No. Well, I was just going to say, let me share with you a story here that I think is pertinent to what you're talking about. I spent a number of years, my wife and I, living out on the Navajo reservation, and I remember hearing a National Public Radio broadcast that they interviewed a Navajo code talker. You know, the Navajo people are very, very proud of the role that the code talkers played in World War II, and it was a very fascinating interview. This interviewer interviewed a code talker who had been in World War II, and he asked him, he said, well, it must have been very difficult to be a Native American in World War II. There must have been a lot of prejudice against you. And the gentleman said, oh, no, not at all. He said it was just the opposite, right? They thought that like every time that I shot the gun, I would hit a bullseye, right? and I was so shocked by this because, but you know, then I think a real truth dawned on me, right? That, oh, well, you know, this is what racism is, or thinking somebody that's less than, right? This is what racism is. You either think that somebody is less than you are, or you think that somebody is better than you are, right? But the one thing that they can't be is just like you, right? and so you say you see the same sort of prejudice spilling over into the field of mythology, right? That these people couldn't read and write, so obviously they were less than us. They were less intelligent than us. But your point is that intelligence has nothing to do with literacy.
No. Actually, the way we structure our thoughts actually structures the way we think. So literacy will change our capacities for thinking. And look, you know, we're in a studio here, we have TV cameras, that's all impossible without literacy. But intelligence is something different. In fact, I mean, a great definition of intelligence isn't book smart, it isn't degrees, it isn't this technology. A great definition of intelligence is the ability to solve problems, right? 50,000 years ago, there were a bunch of people who had some very basic problems. I'm hungry. I've got this huge woolly mammoth. There is no way I can take this thing down. But he looks delicious. So what do? Well, somewhere along the line, someone invents a stone axe. And again, we look at a stone axe and we look at a modern axe and we say, oh, these guys were primitive. But as it turns out, the design of an axe has not changed in the tens of thousands of years since the first one was invented. The design, the weight, the geometry of it, all that has changed is the materials that's made out of it, and we have access to better technologies. But the intelligence behind the invention of the original stone axe is no different than the intelligence behind the replication of that design using different materials. So the point is that I mean, at some point, someone invented writing. Who did that? Well, oral peoples had to do that.
Yeah.
How did they do that? If they were, writing is probably the greatest invention in the history of humanity. It makes space rockets look like small fry. Writing changes everything. Writing is a colossal task of intellectual endeavor. Whoever invented writing belongs with the Einsteins, the Galileos, the Keplers, the Archimedes of our civilization. Who did it? We have no idea. These are people at the very edge of history to which we owe everything and about which we know nothing.
Well, I mean, you know, you often hear people making very popular arguments in the culture that, well, obviously it was the spacemen who invented writing, or you know, the space people who came down and built the pyramids.
Yeah,
right?
let me just say something real quick on that. That's my third category of historical thought, is I call them the conspirators. I know very intelligent people, very bright, and when they look at the ancient past, they look at the Great Pyramid, and their solution to this is the aliens did build it. They cannot believe in their frame of reference, and these people that read philosophy and history, and they're very bright, but they believe that somehow aliens were involved. And really what that is a deep-seated howling point of view, right? That the people in the ancient past just could not think the sophisticated thoughts necessary to create these things. So you get the people who think everyone in the ancient past were primitives, the people who think everyone in the ancient past were romantic spiritual shamans, and then you get the people who combine these two in thinking that civilization starts with some sort of conspiratorial organization, generally aliens that do it, but you know, it eventually leads to the Freemasons and Templars.
Yeah, well, there you go.
And so it's these are caricatures of history.
Yeah.
They're not taking the human being, ourselves, seriously. When we study the past, we're studying ourselves. So people in the past are capable of what we are capable of.
So making this, projecting this idea onto peoples of the past that they are less than we are, right? Because we're literate people and they weren't literate people, right? Is really very similar to
making sexist or racist argumentation, is it? I mean, it's a very, very serious matter.
Well, I don't know. I think it's so ingrained in our assumption, and you know, racism and sexism generally is ingrained into our assumption. Ingrained into our assumption that you know, for tens of thousands of years, people lived like the Aborigines in Australia. So what does that mean? Well, for a lot of people, that means something less. And that is a socially racist, sexist. There's something very filled with hubris about that.
Yeah, yeah.
But the issue is also that this is a fundamentally incorrect assumption. How do we know that everyone, I mean, the human brain is supposed to be about 200,000 years old, right? About 50,000 years ago is when we first start finding sophisticated hunting techniques, art, burial rituals of some sort. But the mind itself goes back another 150,000 years as far as we know. In all that time, did everyone live in loincloths beheading other people, which is often this very primitive point of view? And the point is, one, we have no idea. We have no idea. But you know, they've just discovered over the past couple decades hundreds of henges throughout Europe. These
Hinges.
Henges, like Stonehenge, but all the stones they were actually made out of wood posts, so they're all gone. They've discovered these things with satellites. So they'll take a picture with a satellite of a field, and they're doing it to measure things. And someone says, "Hey, look at this field. There's this like little indentation of a circle. What is that?" So they go and they look at it and they discover this is a henge, like Stonehenge. It was made out of wood, and it dates to 5,000 BCE. So this is 2,500 years, and now they found hundreds of these things. So what this tells you is there is a complexity. What were they used for? You've got hundreds of henges. They all have similar architectural design. There's circular palisade with a hill with certain entrances. A couple of them have been verified to be aligned to the solstice and equinox. So the tradition of Stonehenge goes back millennia. So what are these people thinking? And what does that mean? And where did they come from? And a few other questions. What's this mean for us? If perhaps our howling romantic views are a bit skewed, what does that mean 5,000 years from now when people look back at us? What will they find and what will they say of us? It will be perhaps the greatest punchline if they call us howling barbarians.
Well, you know, one thing it seems to me for certain is that if we continue to believe that oral cultures were less intelligent than we are, less advanced than we are, then we certainly aren't going to go back and learn from those people, are we?
Right.
You know, we with the dismissal of the intelligence is also the dismissal of the wisdom literature and the wisdom tradition of those people. And so I think that's a very, very valuable point that you made here. And also another point that you made about the sorts of prejudice that we project into the past was you made the point that Darwin's theory, which began as a theory of cultural evolution, then
biological evolution.
I'm sorry, biological evolution then was projected onto our intellectual life and our cultural evolution. So could you speak a little bit about that? Because I thought that was a really fascinating point.
Well, that is true. Not deconstructing the biological theory, Darwin's theory of evolution was attached to our ideas of history, to the idea of the evolution of culture and intelligence. And in fact, this idea, this Darwinian idea of history, underwrote much of Nazi thinking, that the Aryan race had finally reached the apex of evolution, and they took scholars, very intelligent scientists. This wasn't justified by religion. This was justified by science, the science of the day. They would go out and they would measure the skulls of indigenous peoples, and they would create this chart where they'd show, well, see, our skulls are slightly different shaped and larger. We have evolved. And they had this whole mythology of where they came from to justify, or at least to explain in their minds, why they were doing what they were doing. You know, the study of history is very interesting, because history happens, things happen, but our construction of history is very often a projection of the modern self. And what we think of the past often informs of what we think of ourselves. And when a revolution occurs in the present, it often begins by rewriting the past, because the past turns into the justification for the present revolution. So here's the thing. I think the Darwinian application to history of the evolution of intelligence and culture is one of the worst things that has happened to our history books. So it's as you said, it damns us from learning about the past. And in a sense, you know, there's no writing in an oral culture to learn from. So it creates the illusion that people only begin thinking when writing starts. And so now we have textbooks filled with this idea of a very primitive past for tens of thousands of years. And you know, my book is just a step back saying, okay, it turns out many 19th and early 20th century theories on myth and history and religion are all rooted in a Darwinian metaphysic of evolution, of mind and spirit. And if we get rid of that, one, it's a supposition. If we get rid of it, what will history now look like? What will religion and myth look like?
Because it's a philosophical blunder, major philosophical blunder.
It is a major.
That keeps us from appropriating the truth and the beauty of these mythic stories coming to us out of the oral tradition.
That is my argument.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, that's a very fascinating argument. And you know, in the second chapter of your book that you call Orality and Literacy, you examine the question as to what are the chief differences between oral thinking and literate thinking. And I was wondering if you could help us understand some of those principles, the analogical principle and the idea that you talk about vertical and horizontal memory.
Yeah. Look, we could spend weeks talking about this. When you study orality as a way of thinking, it is a completely different paradigm. It's a paradigm shift. So here's a couple quid pro quos. We are literate, and our entire thinking is structured by our literacy. So we will never fully understand oral cultures. There's a permanent epistemological divide between literate peoples and oral peoples. There has been a lot of good research on how oral peoples create culture, transmit information. Writers such as Walter Ong and Eric Havelock and McLuhan, people who have studied oral cultures and show how orality really frames how they think and what they do. So here are a couple examples. When a literate person wants to look up an idea, right? Mm-hmm. Where do we go? We go to a book, a dictionary, encyclopedia, Wikipedia now. And do people look up ideas anymore? I don't know if tweeting helps that, but in an oral society, obviously you don't have a book. And you don't even have a conception of a book, right? In a primary oral society. So does that mean you have no ideas? Because there's no way to reference it using writing? No, when an oral person wants to convey an idea, they directly relate that idea to an object in nature. And so this is called the analogy principle. This is coined by a couple writers, Barber and Barber, when they severed the earth from the sky is the name of their book. The analogy principle is oral peoples will relate any function of an object in nature to any other function in an object in nature or what human beings do. They will relate those two by analogy. So if they want to convey an idea about birth and life and death, they're not going to talk about abstract words like conception, inception, decay. They don't have those words in their vocabularies. They're going to talk about a tree, right? Because the tree functionally reveals the entire life cycle. You plant it with the seed, it's buried in the dark earth, it requires rain and sun, there's a sprout, it grows, there's fruit, there's more seeds, it's the entire life cycle. And so while they don't have the abstract jargon that literate peoples have, they have the same thoughts. It's just that they are conveyed through concrete metaphor. And this is myth. So that's the analogy principle. And when you look in the ancient past, one of the shocking things is oral cultures, everything is a metaphor. Everything is symbolic. To literate peoples, this is outside of our box. They would have rituals, and the rituals analogized cosmic cycles with human cycles. This is why everything's aligned to the rising sun and moon and stars, is because the stars revealed certain functions. When a certain star rose, it was summer. When a certain star rose, it was winter. Things grow in spring, things die in winter.
And the star actually was like a celestial archetype, and the reality of Earth it was actually participating in the, so the Earth actually participated in the power of the star, and the star actually was participating in the power of this terrestrial event. Like Paul Tillich was fond of saying that a religious symbol actually participates in the reality to which it points.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's because in oral cultures, a religious symbol is not separated from the thing it symbolizes. In literate cultures, it is. And this is a very good point, which I suppose we'll get to, but in oral cultures, there is no separation between heaven and earth. They belong to the same cosmic fabric. In our little diagrams of how oral peoples constructed their universe with flat discs and elephants, turtles, these are caricatures and comical caricatures of our own literate projections onto them. But also, shockingly, and this is one of the things that really interested me in my study, because as I studied, I discovered that somehow certain stars in the sky were so sacred to indigenous oral peoples. And sadly, there's another principle that orality has, and it's called the silence principle, and that is what is never spoken is forgotten. And it turns out oral societies keep a lot of secrets, right? They're only revealed in initiations, and only certain people are allowed to have them. This is the exact opposite paradigm of a literate person. In our literate world, you want to share as much information as possible, unless it's the ledger. But in academia, it's publish or perish, right? In the oral world, it was the opposite. If you publish, you will perish. And that was literal. There were, in the Greco-Roman mystery religions, if you revealed what happened in the initiations, that was the death penalty, because it was considered so sacred, not of the material world, of the celestial world, and it was to be kept in the celestial world. So,
could you share with us on this point? I thought you shared in your book this very fascinating story coming out of Plato about, was it an Egyptian priest talking about his hesitancy about writing and how that would affect memory.
Yeah, right. The Egyptian god of writing and letters thought comes to King Ammon. This is in the writings of Plato, and he says, "Look, I have got a new invention, and it's going to change your civilization. It is writing. You will be able to learn more. You'll be able to share more. It will change everything." And it did, by the way. And the king says, "No, I don't want it." And the justification for rejecting writing is very interesting. He essentially says, if I take that, it will make me stupid. So here's the
Fascinating.
thing. Yeah, it is. Actually, this was an argument that lasted all through the Middle Ages. There were oral monks, you know, and the monasteries were in charge of hand copying texts. And there were oral monks who said the multiplication of books makes men less studious because they rely on text to keep their memories for them. And this was the complaint of King Ammon. If we apply writing, a couple things are going to happen here. One, we spend a lot of our lives doing things to remember what needs to be remembered. And we will stop doing them if we have writing. And it turns out these things that we do to help us remember include rituals, sacrifices, dances, and all of them are connected, by the way, to the cosmos, to stars that rise. When a certain star rises, you do a ritual. When a certain star sets, you do a ritual. And it explained, whatever that star meant to that culture, what was happening in the culture. And so there was this synthetic relationship between what they believed, what they were transmitting, what they were doing. And the king understood that writing would take all that away.
And he was absolutely right.
And he was absolutely right.
You know, it's, when I lived on the Navajo Nation, I was involved in education. And it was very interesting because I think Western people would say, well, you know, it's really a wonderful thing. Education is always a wonderful thing. And so they were well-intentioned when the white man brought his educational process into Native American culture. And let's take the Navajo, for example, right? But as a result of taking the child out of the home in which this oral transmission occurred, of sacred knowledge, right? So in other words, it was in the home where the child learned from his grandfather, from his great-grandfather, from his uncles, how to perform these rituals, right?
Right.
And he learned the sacred stories, how to make the sacred sand paintings, right? And there would be, originally, some of these ceremonies of the Navajo people would last for days, maybe 9 days at a time. So can you imagine trying to remember all of these sand paintings, right? All of these prayers, all of these chants, all of these songs that had to be sung over 9 days. Taking the child out of that environment in which this oral knowledge was transmitted, right? Even though we were well-intentioned, right? Taking that child out of that environment and educating that child as a white person. The unintended consequence was a radical destruction of the ritual process of the Native American people, of the Navajo people. Now, in contemporary Navajo culture, a medicine person may know 2 or 3 chants. The ceremonies may last 2 or 3 days, right? But there are very few people that have this knowledge anymore of these longer ceremonies. You know, that's really a sad thing to loss. But you see, it was an unintended consequence, but what a radical consequence that was for the people.
The greatest transformation of consciousness in the history of our species is the introduction of writing. Mm-hmm. And, you know, look, there are huge upsides, but there are some downsides. I am glad I'm a literate person. It provides me with air conditioning and a refrigerator. But there are some downsides. Our writing, our ideas are no longer directly connected to the things that produced them. Which means anything can mean anything. And in an age of rhetoric, anything does mean anything. Rhetoric is created by literacy.
So you would want to make a sort of argument that literacy brings about a sort of a way of thinking. We might call this a logical or mathematical abstraction, which actually creates a distance between the human mind and its ontological grounding, so to speak, right?
That is very true.
Yeah. And so simply because someone came from an oral society, their cosmological understanding of the world could even be more truthful and more profound than ours, because they were connected with the cosmos in a much more profound way that we are not. We are more abstracted from nature. We are more abstracted from the stars. Most of us can't even see the starry sky anymore. I find these very fascinating, very interesting notions that you have.